directed towards the relevant co-author. Our moderator for today's launch event is Mr. Davinder Sandhu, co-founder and chairman of Primus Partners. Mr. Sandhu brings in 35 years of experience across government, the World Bank Group, and the private sector in leadership roles. A veteran in policy formulation, infrastructure development, and advisory, he has held senior positions, including being Sector Director, Transport and Disaster Management at the Prime Minister's Office, Government of India, as the country representative on the executive board of the World Bank Group, and as head of network operations at Indian Railways in the past. Mr. Sandhu also brings a wealth of expertise in the logistics and supply chain sectors, both in India and internationally. I now hand over to Mr. Sandhu. Mr. Sandhu, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks. Thank you, and uh, great opportunity to network, interact, and share thoughts with this very august panel. And I hope that the audience today, I can see a number of people already joined in. Welcome, everybody. And I think this august panel's thoughts and how we look into their mind in this entire sector going forward is going to be a treat today afternoon. So welcome, gentlemen, to quickly introduce um, uh, Professor Desai, Associate Professor, Operations Research at the Indian Institute of Management in Bangalore. Dr. Gupta, CEO of the Supply Chain Management Center at IIM Bangalore. Both of you at one of the great institutes that's working on supply chain management. I've been here at the institute, invited by Professor Raghuram, former director, a number of times, and interacted with all of you. And maybe I must have with you also. So very happy to see you. And welcome, James, the TMX Asia lead, a professional from the field who's going to share all the good thoughts and all the challenges that lie ahead for all of us to work together. And my old friend Paul from Delhi, leading MEBTC as the managing director and being the connect between India and Europe at many forums. So welcome all of you, gentlemen. And I think this is, I mean, it's always appropriate in the sense to do supply chain management and logistics as one of the fundamental drivers of any economy, any process, small, big, global scale, local scale. But even more so now as we see a redefinition of supply chains across the world, both in terms of raw commodities, basic commodities, so semi-value added goods and then final goods, and how they move between countries and intra-countries, the costs involved, the opportunities for investments, the opportunities for employment opportunities. So I think this is again a time when we need to have a relook at the entire picture here. And clearly we see growth drivers. And I think thank you to all of you for working together and bringing out this excellent white paper. A lot of new thoughts, a lot of new ideas in the old mix, but even the new challenge of automation and how we can leverage that in both in the developing world across Southeast Asia and South Asia. As these economies now also start becoming more better networked, economically connected. I mean, most of the time, these countries have not been, especially in South Asia, the regional trade, the economic cooperation, that clearly needs a leg up. And I think the thoughts that you bring in that white paper is something that policymakers can clearly work on to make sure that there is much progress in that count. So from your white paper, I see, I mean, to add, some thoughts on this, look at the global trade. I mean, if you look at this year's India's financial year closing, record exports and record imports. I mean, that's the kind of trade opportunities that lie within India and South Asia at this point of time. So there is a great push in the domestic economy. If I see India's own endeavors, some of them are coming home in the sense that the government is focused. There is a Gati Shakti directorate within the Department of Investment Promotion and Trade, Internal Trade. and therefore the layering of the all the infrastructure assets that lie within the government. I believe at this point of time, I was in conversation with the joint secretary who's heading it, and I believe there are 267 layers that are already inside the Gati Shakti. I mean, that's a fabulous, geotagging of every asset that's around, and I think that's going to be a big leg up as we move forward. Also, I think agriculture. I mean, let's face it. There is 65% of the population that's dependent on agriculture, and if we don't have agricultural incomes moving up, then we have a developmental challenge in the long run. And therefore, what supply chain management, the whole cold chain, the logistics process, how it can make sure that the agriculture sector gets a value add and increases its share of pie in the overall GDP cake. That is really important for India as a development driver to move forward. Also, the the now reasonably stabilized experiment of the GST implementation and how that makes the possibility of diversified supply chain centers across the country linked together in a GST chain. Earlier, companies had a tendency to have their warehouses right next to their plants or the consumption centers or the production centers. But I think with the removal of that particular disabler, with the
Sure.
GST coming in, I think that's a major step that we can do. Uh, and finally, what's grappling with us today, I think, is the whole issue around energy prices. Both, I mean, if India has 72% of its energy pack out of coal, if you look at coal, I mean, that itself, one of the largest commodities in India to move, and what can be done in logistics in that, how that can be automated better, and the whole process. But even for fuel, I think the whole issue is that for the producers, the costs of production are rising because of the energy costs. And if this is the scenario that's going forward, then the kind of processes that all of you have thought about and documented in the white paper, both in terms of retrofitting existing warehouses and in terms of building new warehouses which have a greater degree of automation, and how that can help level out the sort of cost push pressure that's coming on manufacturers in their commodities. So in addition to the wonderful points that all of you have sort of put forward in that white paper, when I was reading across, and I thought, these are something thoughts that I could add to the mix as we go forward today. I think these, India's own ambitions and actual achievements last year in global trade, and its clear need for making sure that the cost push of energy prices is brought down, and what we can do in supply chain management through fresh automation and through retrofitting are sort of very, very important points to go ahead. So let's sort of jump into it. And uh, uh, Professor Desai, let me come to you first. And some of the questions that were there in my mind, and uh, you know how do you see this? I mean, the Indian government has been moving ahead, right from the budget papers to the economic survey to almost the daily statements by all the ministers who are involved in the logistics chain process, whether the fixed infrastructure or the policy drivers. All of them have documented several steps to bring down India's logistics costs. So, what do you think is important, and how do you see this going forward in terms of the policy push?
Thank you, Mr. Sandhu, for the wonderful introduction. First and foremost, let me start off by thanking EBTC, TMX, and of course, IIM Bangalore itself for collaborating on this white paper. Uh, I want to sort of take a step back first and ask ourselves, why is this paper important now, right? Why are we writing a paper on warehousing? I think COVID has basically forced us to rethink a lot of strategies. I think it's important this is sort of a life-changing event, perhaps once in a generation, is the kind of a scenario that the pandemic has given us, and it's forcing supply chains globally, worldwide, to rethink some of the strategies that we are doing. If you haven't heard of the word supply chains before, you definitely have heard it over the last couple of years. And warehouses are an integral part of the supply chain. They are essentially the place where logistics connects with inventory, right? You can store either finished goods in a warehouse, you can store raw material in the warehouse, and so therefore it sort of becomes a linking point where traditional supply chain from production and manufacturing sort of gets linked with logistics, and that's really the linking part. Uh, in terms of, again, warehouses also occupy a significant cost in the supply chain segment. If you think of the entire supply chain as starting all the way from manufacturing till it reaches the consumer, warehouses occupy a fairly significant cost. There is capital costs of building a new warehouse. Along with that comes the insurance and all of that of the goods that are stored there. Lead times in transportation would then depend upon where your warehouses are located. So they form a sort of a very important and an integral part of the supply chain. And I think it's important for us to sort of look at warehouses, and that's sort of the reason and the dynamic as to why we wrote the white paper on warehousing. Uh, as Davinder mentioned, with GST coming into effect in 2017, warehousing saw a significant boost in India. Right, we were at, I think, somewhere close to 35 million square feet of warehousing in 2017. By in the next couple of years, by 2019 or early 2020, we were already at about 80 million square feet, and that basically was because, exactly like what you said, the regional warehouses, the notion of having regional warehouse in a particular state because you didn't want to pay octroi tax when you crossed over state borders and so on. That notion went away. We went to a national framework for GST, and therefore it gave firms the ability to sort of spread their wings, and then they sort of started putting up warehouses all over the country, and that sort of led to a huge investment in warehousing. And I think this trend has pretty much been accelerated with COVID as well. I think the government has seen this. There are essentially three different policies that are in place, at least from a governmental level. I see the national logistics policy, the new national warehousing policy that's coming in, and the PM's Gati Shakti plan. I think all of these three are sort of interconnected, large drivers where they've given logistics and warehousing the same status as infrastructure. And I think that's an important step because we should be viewing supply chains as infrastructure. And therefore, when the government makes a move in that particular direction, it gives a new impetus to building new warehouses and to bring in new fresh thought into the warehousing industry. Um, there are questions though that have to be answered, right? I mean, for example, there are regulations in terms of, you know, what is the location for warehouses? Can we allow firms, private or public, to be able to operate a warehouse anywhere? Do we need to create, special economic zones where warehouses can be located? Uh, what safety measures are mandatory when people, products, and services operate within those warehouses? What are the timelines in which this needs to be done? There are several important questions that are still sort of missing in the logistics plan and the logistics policy that is being advocated by the government. But having said that, there are certain regulatory authorities in warehousing that already exist. For example, WDRA, which is the Warehousing Development and Regulatory Authority. That's part of the Department of Food and public distribution. That, of course, caters only to warehousing within the food administration. So there is regulatory frameworks that are in place in India. It's just that we need to be able to sort of take that, move them across to different industrial sectors as well. I mean, that I think really is going to be the push for the next 5 years, and I think that's really where policy making from the government is going to play a hand. And of course, the moment you start setting up multimodal parks and you say that, look, I'm different logistics providers, a train can carry 3,000 metric tons, whereas a truck carries only 30 metric tons as an approximation. So the moment you have a larger warehouse, you can dump a lot more material there, but then when it comes to, it has to be integrated with logistics, because for a firm that's using that, you have to be able to now receive, if a train comes in and drops off 3,000 metric tons of shipment, where am I going to store it unless I have a warehouse large enough to do it? So there is inventory, there's logistics, there is warehousing, all of that is interconnected, of course, within the supply chain. And I think that's really where the comprehensive policy making framework should head towards. Yeah, I'll stop here, Davinder, and I'll.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Desai. I think that was very comprehensive. Paul, you will get reminded of this, and this is something that we've been advocating at a large number of forums, including within the government. I was part of the team that drafted the announcement for adding infrastructure status to logistics as part of the Ministry of Finance's harmonized list of infrastructure, because that has got consequences down the line, how it is taxed, how it is seen by lending industry, by banks, etc. But the question that I've always been asking, what does that word mean? What is logistics? Is a truck parking logistics asset? I mean, it could be anything. I mean, right from A to B to Z, could be. So the issue that we've been advocating, Professor Desai, is standards, because it is only that will allow interoperability of both rolling as well as fixed assets on the logistics space. If I am a truck driver or a truck owner and I am going from one end of the country to the other, then I must know that when I will dock at a logistics asset 2,000 kilometers away, that platform height will be exactly the same as it was when I started. Today trucks, and they dock in a platform. Somewhere it is 2 feet higher, somewhere it is 2 feet lower, and I can't unload. And trucks can wait for a day looking for a forklift or something. It's if the equipment is heavy. So will I find a forklift? What is the classification of that logistics asset? Is there a BIS standard? And standardization brings lowering of costs, and it allows interoperability. And finally, I think that's a very important part of the mix that you would like to consider, I think, as sort of all of us together pushing the government to say, set up standards. There should be a book of standards about logistics. What is a logistics asset? And define the standards around that. But thank you for your thoughts on this. And let me come to Dr. Gupta with a request. Let us know a lot is happening. One of the fundamental drivers that's happening across space in infrastructure and logistics is the lowering cost of sensor-based data acquisition. And that's really a remarkable revolution that's going on. So with all that's happening in infrastructure, in logistics infrastructure, with increasing space, increasing demands, new scenarios being generated, how do you see IoT and automation and all this process come together in India?
Okay, so thanks, Mr. Sandhu, for your question. So let me first start with maybe we can. I think you spoke about drivers, so let me first talk about two very important industries which are using these particular technologies, say e-commerce and hyperlocal. Okay, so these are two sectors which are really transforming the landscape of warehousing industry in India, and they are pushing the edges of warehousing industry from both the sides. So at one end of the spectrum, we are seeing e-commerce industries which are hiring warehouses which are 2 lakh square feet, 5 lakh square feet, even 1 million square feet. So that kind of a deals which are happening on the e-commerce side. At the same time, we are seeing so many warehouses which are coming up in every nook and corner of the city. So we have, can you imagine a warehouse maybe in South Extension in Delhi or maybe in Indranagar in Bangalore? But today there are hyperlocal or what we call as a dark store which are coming up in every part of the city. So what we are now seeing is there are warehouses which are say from 2,000 square feet a dark store to maybe a 2 million e-commerce warehouse which is there, and both these sizes of the warehouses are catering to what we call as the B2C customer. So that's one of the most significant things which are happening as far as warehousing is concerned, as far as India is concerned. Now, when I come to say IoT and all the technologies which are there, okay. So at the end of the day, what is the purpose of a technology? The purpose of a technology is to improve the performance of the warehouse or the KPI of the warehouse. Now, when we talk about any warehouse, particularly if you talk about hyperlocal or if you talk about e-commerce warehouse, then the most important KPI for the warehouse is the picking time. So one of the significant solution or the technology solutions which are happening is to reduce the picking time to the extent possible. Now, if I give you an example for a 10 minutes grocery delivery, if you spend 5 minutes in picking the goods, then the game is completely lost. So today we have AI-based tools which are helping you to forecast what is going to be the demand. We have tools which are helping you to place the fastest moving goods at the most pickable location. We have IoT-based tools which are helping to reduce the time that the operator has to move within the warehouse to pick up the goods. So a lot of technologies, whether it is IoT, whether it is AI, whether it is put to light, whether it is pick to light, all these particular technology are governed first to reduce the picking time in the warehouse, which is the most important KPI which is there in the warehouse. So once we have set this particular KPI in order, then we have other technologies from ASRS to robotics to AGV and others, which are governed towards, I would say, improving the productivity and the efficiency of the warehouse.
Okay, thanks, Dr. Gupta. I think this is, you picked out the sort of the fundamental KPI as of the asset, and I think that's clearly what it is. If I am going to go to a warehouse, then I must have the least dwell time, as they call it, ports,
Yeah, absolutely.
and then I get my stuff out and go on for delivery. And clearly, of course, those KPIs, as you said, sometimes nowadays, you're right. I mean, delivery times as less than 10 minutes, because if I'm ordering a small quantity from a local source, then I may not want to wait for more than 15 minutes, So absolutely right. I think those points are there. But sometime in the conversation, I will come back to you to talk about costs and how technology can lower costs. Well, let me, for the moment, go to James. James, welcome. And with all your experience across Asia, let's hear your thoughts on first, what do you think are, say, the top of your mind innovations in either policy or practice or technology that you see are happening in this geography? And what can be done to the existing warehouses? I mean, we can't throw them away, especially in a developing country. Asset costs need to be milked to the maximum. So what can we do to existing warehouses to improve them?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me, Davinder, and yeah, it's been a great part to be part of this white paper as we've put it together. But really, I think what's changed, and the pandemic's really made that occur, is the needs of customers and the wants of customers, and I think that's worldwide. It's not India specific. It's not Southeast Asia specific. It's really, customers are wanting more. They're wanting it more quickly, and as was said earlier, everyone now knows what supply chain is. Supply chain is now a topic that's talked about in every board meeting of just about every company around the world. As part of that, we really need to look at what technology can actually be implemented. And I think over the last few years, there's been a real democratization of technology, be it from an IT point of view, software as a service. You can buy things cheaply at a monthly rent. You're not investing hundreds of thousands of dollars and months and months and months to implement the world's best warehouse management system or transport management system, for one of an example. So, that's really allowed, many more companies. The barrier to entry is so much lower. And similarly, from a physical assets point of view, as was talked about before, mobile robotics, have really allowed, again, companies to invest, to start looking at better ways to reduce costs in the supply chain, to reduce the number of touches to get a parcel out to a customer. And that reduction in cost, that shortening of the return on investment, is really changing the way that people look at automation, look at technology implementation. And I think there was a question that came through just before around people. I don't see it as a replacement of people so much as an upskilling of people to really make what was once just a warehouse working job where you're picking boxes up, you're moving boxes all day. You're now potentially an engineer looking after technology day in, day out. So there's that real upskilling. We're not replacing people. It's really making sure that the customer promise is there, the customers are wanting more, and utilising that technology and investment correctly to make sure that you're serving your customer at the end of the day. They're happy and they come back for more for the next sale.
Yeah, thanks, James. I think that was a very important topic that you touched on, jobs, because jobs and good jobs is something that's very much part of the focus. And I also saw a question in the chat box as you did around jobs. And I mean, let's go back 30 years and people said that PCs will kill jobs, but all that new technology did was it proliferated jobs in new areas and helped everybody else to grow. I mean, economies grew. There was earlier a fear that PC automation and office automation will destroy jobs. And I see right now, if I look at logistics, what made us go through the pandemic was the availability of logistics. And I think a fantastic sort of rising to the occasion of the challenge by logistics service providers. We were all kept going because things reached. And if I see what's happened over the last 2-3 years, automation and the new technologies that are coming have actually increased the number of jobs. Let's take a specific personal example. I mean, if I needed let's say a medication, or a cough syrup or something, I could walk out my house and I could, go and get that and come back in 15 or 20 minutes. But like I'm now, if I'm engaged and I'm not able to leave my house or my office, I can tap onto my cell phone and I can get the same tablet or cough syrup or something delivered to my house from the local market in the same 10 minutes. But what has actually happened is I've created a job, something that I would have done myself. I put myself to better use, sharing my time in a better fashion, at the same time creating a job in the supply chain cycle. And the number of youngsters that I see engaged in the supply chain cycle is a fantastic, sort of example to go forward, to say that, these fears are not, I wouldn't say they're not well-founded. These questions are very important in deciding policies. But I think the evidence says that these fears may be over-exaggerated. And if you run it well, and the way the sector is developing, I see more number of jobs coming than less number of jobs. I see economic enablers that allow explosion of economic activities, and therefore that will cause more jobs. Thank you, James. So Paul, let me come to you, and you've been interacting at the regulation space, at the policy space, incentives, interacting between Europe, India, getting both the geographies together in a number of areas. So, and now we are seeing India and Europe engaged in FTA conversations. A very good example where the FTA with the UAE has just been signed off around 5 or 6 weeks ago. So from your perspective, what are those sort of key markers or KRIs for ensuring that there is inflow of investments into the logistic segments in India, and what are the critical factors that makes it succeed?
Thanks a lot, Davinder, and thank you also for all the insights from my co-authors. And let me also start by saying that I found the title absolutely tantalizing, how to leverage warehousing technology for India's deep integration into global supply chains. And that's what really piqued my interest and joined IIM Bangalore and James and TMX to write this paper, because I've been in India for the past 17 years, and the first 5 years was specifically in the logistics space. Early days of logistics in India by European standards, if you will. And for the past 12 years, my hat has been trying to make collaborations between Europe and India happen, and also investment into India. So I'm actually one of the largest promoters of India when I travel in Europe. Say, do come to India. India has a lot to offer. And interestingly, it does not only have a domestic market to offer, which is obviously the first initial point that's interesting for foreign investors, but it also has the ability to engage in a collaboration between Europe and India, develop something in India that's more and higher likely for success in India, and then you might have something for a global market. Now, why am I spending time on all this background is simply because a lot of investment and a lot of people that we have, investors that have looked at India, one of the tick boxes when they go through a requirement, why should we invest, has always been infrastructure, logistics, and that has been a deal breaker very often, because many investors will look at the domestic market, which is great in itself, but it would be even more tantalizing if India could be even better integrating global supply chains who could actually manufacture in India and supply other markets. Now, I'll be honest with you, Europe has been very China-centric for a long time. And in the past 2 years, I think, with the situation that as we've all gone through, it has been clear that we need to be less China-centric and look at other geographies as well. So the China plus one strategy became quite prevalent with European investors, and I think also other international investors. And now with the geopolitical situation that has recently happened in Europe, obviously the +1 is probably not going to be Russia. So it will be looking at even further intensifying other candidates for the +1. And I think India is a nice bride, if you will. And especially with all that has happened, we can see that logistics, you mentioned it, Davinder, yourself, that the logistics service providers have been incredible in actually adapting to new consumption patterns in India and new demands of customers that James was talking about. And that can only be dealt with professional, with efficient supply chains, of which warehousing, of course, an incredible important part, because they're the interface between manufacturers and consumers. They're the interface between demand and supply. And I don't know how many times I've heard about, whenever there's been talk about automation in Indian warehouses, there's always been an instance of, no, it's not possible. India's too hot. India's too dusty. India's too humid. It's easier to get higher labor force involved in it. And I think now what we're seeing is a trend to understanding that efficiency in warehousing will only happen if we do increase automation. I'm not saying complete automation. First investments in semi-automated warehouses in India show actually a very swift return on investment. So this anxiety about a high capex and maybe even a higher opex is unfounded, but we need to create awareness about that. I think that's also what the white paper is all about. And I'm happy to see, Professor Desai, you mentioned it in terms of the government policies, the national logistics policy, the national warehousing policy, the Gati Shakti program, quite a few other issues as well. And being the chairman of ASSOCHAM's National Logistics Council, I know to what extent we're actually trying to promote these issues as increasingly important if India, as an economy, as a country, wants to attract investment, increase economic growth. There's no way about it without increasing the efficiency and the growth of the logistics sector. I mean, it's I think if an economy grows at X%, the logistics economy has to grow with X plus 2 to 3%, yeah, to accommodate that economic growth. And I see that's what we're on the cusp of seeing here, and that's why it's increasingly important that the government initiatives, the government incentives and policies dovetail with business and investors, which I see is picking up in not only the warehousing, but actually automation and technology use in warehousing, of which I was impressed to see with what James has done in Asia in a variety of sectors, and how that has actually benefited also in Asian countries, in emerging markets, to semi-automate warehouses. And I also find it tantalizing that from the idea of thinking that automation can only happen if we actually first build the automation and then build 4 walls around it, then we have a warehouse, to say, no, there's actually technologies now that James mentioned that can actually be retrofitted into existing warehouses to a certain extent. So yeah, that was it for now, Davinder. Back to you.
Thanks, Paul. So in my interaction over the last 10 years with the various authorities of these in Delhi as well as in the state government capitals, and I've been involved with, vibrant Gujarat and magnetic Maharashtra and happening Haryana and momentum Jharkhand and, all these investment promotion events that take place. And I've always been saying, no investor will come because you'll give them some tax incentive. Any tax can be factored into a cash flow cycle. That's not permanent. What the investor is looking for is infrastructure. They're looking for smoother infrastructure that lowers their costs. And finally, they're looking for a market. So we need to help people finding a domestic market where the product can be sold, and a infrastructure environment where their costs can be low, and maybe that's global supply chain that supplies the Indian domestic market, as well as find space abroad, because we help the investor lower their cost of production from some other country A, B, or C. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that's fundamental. And I think those learnings are now coming into Indian policymakers and the government. Going forward, I think we will see evidence of that. So that's absolutely right. And when we look at the industry that we're all gathered here today, This is sort of one of the providers of last resort. I mean, you could have a avant-garde product, but as long as you don't have the infrastructure to build it and move it to your customer, we'll never be able to live up to those expectations. So that's absolutely fundamental. So just to recap quickly, I think Professor Desai, you brought about the event, the pandemic event, and how that has changed life. Your conversation encouraged conversation around standards, the need for standards that helps location, where should it be set up, and those questions are better answered in today's policy regime. Dr. Gupta, you pointed us to the ultimate KPI, picking time, and how various technologies, both for retrofitting as well as new builds that allow us to address efficient logistics infrastructure. James, your field experience clearly spoke through when you focused on customers, and that customers want more and they want it in better time. And also the fact that it's not that jobs are going to go down. I think that's very important. That fear needs to be taken away. If efficient logistics will aid the growth of the economy, it will aid the growth of good jobs. It's not a threat to jobs to automate or semi-automate based on whatever is the industry requirement. And Paul, the ideas you flagged in terms of the necessities that investors look for remain very critical, and I think we will all document that as learnings as part of this white paper. So great thoughts. Can we open for questions? I think Gaurav is somewhere in the background. So if you can just let us have some questions. So one question that I can see is right away, and let me ask you, James, an industry expert. So the question says, what is better? Should there be multiple smaller warehouses, or maybe for one state build one mega warehouse, or so where are you placed around that thought?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It really comes back to brands and manufacturers understanding what their network is, and coming back to the customer, how quickly you want to get to your customer. Yeah, a mega warehouse might work perfectly if you deliver to your customers once a week, and there's 3 days from your order to delivery to your customer. If you need to deliver in 15 minutes, like we were talking about before, for medicine or groceries or something, your solution is very different. It's far smaller. It's hyper local. It's a dark store out the back of maybe a supermarket if you were in Singapore or Australia, or a small mini mart or something in India. So it really is dependent on what your product is and how quickly you need to get there. So there's sort of not one size fits all, but it's really understanding your network, and that's sort of what we do a lot with our customers. Is what is their network? What is their growth? Because your growth will also change how you look at your mega warehouses. Are you better to do multiple smaller ones that you can grow into? And it really there's those dynamics that need to be considered before you commit to a large new warehouse that one warehouse that serves all of India, for example.
Yeah, so suit the market, and possibilities lie across the spectrum, whether smaller ones or bigger ones. But finally, the whole idea is suit the market and the customer and find the fit. Dr. Gupta, I think there's a question that we have here,
Sure.
which says that is there some measure, or some standards, or if you want a better word, but of updation of warehouses? I mean, how does one know whether I need to update, and what would be that standard of updation? How do you calculate whether my technology is, too old, or how to find the relevant fit for that? I think that's what the question is. How to sort of update, and then how to sort of benchmark that updation that I want to do of any warehouse.
So, first of all, at the end of the day, why does the warehouse exist? So a warehouse exists to service a customer. So the first parameter to gauge a performance of any warehouse is as to where are we in terms of service level. So if our service levels are at par with other warehouses or other service providers, or with the best of the industry, then obviously our warehouse performance is fine. So that is the first thing that we need to look into. So if our service parameters are not up to the mark, then obviously we need to improve that. And once we have put our service in place, then perhaps we can look at other parameters, which is in terms of cost also. So can we deliver our services at the least possible cost? So that's the second parameter that comes in. So then you try to make it your warehouses and operation as efficient as possible, and maybe investment of technology, processes, or whatever you have to invest to make your cost as the least. So it is service followed by cost. I think that's a template one can follow.
Yeah, thanks for that. I do think that maybe as a follow-on, I think I'm quickly thinking across the industry that clearly there is a great demand and people want to invest in updation. I think for these groups, some kind of a follow-up on that, I think would be rewarding for us. I think there would be willing ears out there to listen to more thoughts on this idea. But Professor Desai, somebody is requesting a very interesting question, and they're saying that the WDRA is way back in 2013, 2007, 13 years or 14 years ago. Yeah, so you think there is need to make any changes to reflect the realities of today's supply chain management industry and warehousing?
Yeah, I think that's exactly what we were talking about before. The new warehousing policy, I think, is going to become important. I think there are many reasons why we should be looking at a new warehousing policy at the government level. The first, I think, again, I think globally supply chains had moved to this notion of just-in-time production. Right? When Toyota pioneered this long ago in the 70s and in the 80s, they were talking about lean inventory, very small, just-in-time production, and that sort of works when you have a demand that can be forecasted reasonably accurately. If you don't have that, then there's this move back. I think we're going back in circles, right? Where we're going back to now what we call just in case, where they're storing larger amounts of inventory. And in fact, I mean, it was extreme to the extent that when General Motors in the 70s had about 3,500 suppliers, Toyota was able to manufacture this with 250. Right? I mean, that was the difference in terms of just in time versus what existed traditionally. But now I think we're sort of going back because just to add to James's point earlier, apart from satisfying customer demand, I think there's a risk component that's involved in supply chain. I think supply chain risk has to be addressed, and that only happens when you have diversification of your warehouses. So diversification of supplier basis, you could be, and that could happen because you want to be closer to consumer demand, or because maybe you just want to protect your assets a little better. Of course, this leads to one-time cost. I mean, this would then essentially mean that if I have to diversify my number of warehouses, then I have to invest capex, right? I have to be able to move to a new geographic location, set up the warehouse, train the local workforce. So there's a significant amount of investment that's involved. The size and number of warehouses is also growing. That's another trend that we've been seeing across the world. And of course, digitalization, leads to improved sensing and so on. So there's automation and technology that the other panelists have already spoken about. So I think all of this combined, calls for a new policy. We cannot just essentially stick to an old policy that exists. And I think that's really where the government is looking at the new warehousing policy, of integrating that with logistics, with automation, with global integration of supply chains. And yeah, I think it's fair to say that. And the other thing that I think we should acknowledge is that by and large, within the government, we've moved to mostly a PPP kind of a mode, the public-private partnership mode. I think the current administration is very much for it. And I think people in general are now more used to automation. When automation was coming into place, 5-10 years ago, there was perhaps a sense that the workforce was not aligned with it. But I think we're sort of crossing that hump now. I think newer workers are better equipped to deal with automation. And just to tie the question before, I don't think it's leading to a loss in jobs. It just means that the jobs get transferred elsewhere. Autonomous vehicles is, by the way, another great example of logistics, right? If you have a driverless truck that's plying the roads, then all of these drivers are without a job. Along with those drivers not having a job, the dhabas where they eat food, all of that entire ecosystem that surrounds the highway also disappears. So what are we going to do with all of that social capital? But then what happens essentially is that they sort of move into construction of electrical, charging stations. So that all of that infrastructure needs to be built, and therefore there's a new ecosystem and a new industry that gets created. And essentially, when the government formulates a policy, they would of course have to look at the cost of social capital, the cost of cultural capital, all of that loss that happens, and where do we accommodate, this.
Yes, I think that was quite comprehensive. Absolutely, in terms of the additionalities and externalities that any policy throws up, both on the people side as well as on the asset side, is something that every policy has to factor in. And since this is a sector so fundamentally connected, right along the way with multiple connections to people and assets right along the chain of supply, those issues are critically important to address. So that's what gets in buy-in. And clearly, Paul, no investor will come in if there is, inadequate attention paid to the decrease in any social capital that may be happening or employment opportunities that may be happening. Fundamentally, we don't want a disturbed environment because investment thrives in stable social societies, and that's absolutely fundamental to going forward. So yeah, that's fantastic. So we come to the end of our time. Thank you so much, all of you. A truly august panel for your thoughts, and wonderful audience. Some very pointed questions made us think a little bit more, and perhaps some thoughts on our future knowledge products and intellectual thinking and points of view going forward. All in all, a fabulous time. Thank you so much. Let me hand back to Gaurav, how he wants to take it from here.
Thank you. Thank you for that very insightful discussion. I think the white paper has been, talked about. The insights have really been sort of highlighted over here. So it only remains for me to thank our moderator, Mr. Sandhu, our four co-authors, Professor Desai, Dr. Gupta, Mr. Jensen, and Mr. James Christopher, for their support. I would also like to mention that the white paper is now available on the websites of both IIM Bangalore, of TMX, and of EBTC. Thank you very much for your time, and have a good rest of the day.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Davinder.
Bye.
See you all.